I left off with Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, and how he was leading attacks against Native Americans to kind of clear them from areas as white Americans are heading out west to search for gold. Um, and one of the place that he is most associated with in battle is the battle at Little Bighorn. So, just a little background on Custer. He had served in the Union Army during the Civil War. He was known for being extraordinarily vain and kind of big on himself. He was also known for his hair, his gorgeous golden locks of his hair. In fact, the natives, when they referred to him, often called him Chief Yellow Hair. Um, and if you've ever seen the movie Night at the Museum, Battle of the Smithsonian, it's the second one of the series. There is a character. He is a character in that movie, and it's a pretty funny portrayal of him. If you know a little bit about him and know a little bit about the history, you catch a couple of jokes that are made at his expense. But so what happened at Little Bighorn? Well, the Sioux natives that were there were led by Sitting Bull. And Sitting Bull allegedly had a vision of U.S. soldiers attacking his men and natives falling from their horses, and he interpreted this to mean that they were about to be attacked. So he prepared his men and his tribe for the attack. And so when Custer and his division arrived there, they were ready for him. And Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, who were both leaders of that division of the Sioux, they attacked, and Custer was killed, as well as all of his division of men. The entire 7th Cavalry was wiped out at the Battle of Little Bighorn. So this is often referred to as Custer's last stand. And one side little note that I think is kind of interesting is that there is a pro football player who plays, I should say, used to play for the Patriots and then the Colts, is Adam Vinatieri. I'm not sure if I said his name right. He was a place kicker. And this may be completely outdated because he might be retired by now. I'm not sure. Anyway, his great-great-grandfather was actually at the Battle of Little Bighorn in Custer's division as a like bandmaster, leading like the like drum and fife kind of band that they had, except he was told to hang back and stay at camp during the battle, and so he actually wasn't at the battle, which was very beneficial to him because the whole division got wiped out. But then his great-great-grandson becomes a Super Bowl champion, which is kind of cool little story. Anyway, moving on. So one thing that I think is kind of interesting in South Dakota, I went to go see Mount Rushmore, which some of you, I'm sure you're all familiar with. But what fewer people know about is another memorial that is out in South Dakota, carved into a mountain. And it's actually still in the process of being carved. And that is a memorial to Crazy Horse, one of the Sioux leaders. There were people who were particularly natives who were upset with, American presidents who kind of represent a government that was not, good for Native Americans, having their faces on a big mountain. And so there was a movement started to have a memorial also done to a native leader carved into a mountain, and it's all done through private funds, and it's being constructed over like the last 60 years or so, and they're not even close to being finished. But this is the Crazy Horse Memorial that you can go see. It's sort of a profile of his face here, and the drawing here on the side of the mountain is showing where the horse is. He's going to be sitting on a horse and pointing out over the distance. This is going to be his finger kind of pointing out, and this is the horse's head, and you'll see what it's supposed to look like here. Here's sort of a model of what it should eventually look like, and this is where they are. And by the way, this is from about 4 years ago. I don't know what they've completed since then, but it's an extremely slow process, so they might have the whole hand. They were working on the finger when I was there. They might have the whole finger done now. I'm not sure. Anyway, I thought it was kind of cool. Here's a close-up of Crazy Horse and his face on the mountain. And by the way, Mount Rushmore can fit, I think it's something like 3 of Mount Rushmore's can fit just into the head of Crazy Horse. That's how big this monument is. It's crazy. So there it is. There's me with a selfie in front of it and my family that we went to go see it. And here is what it should eventually look like. All right, so to a different group of natives in Idaho. Hang on. Nez Perce was a tribe in Idaho led by a man named Chief Joseph, who is a pretty famous native leader as well. And Chief Joseph basically attempted to resist being put onto reservations, and they were eventually chased off their land. They fled upwards towards Canada. I think they were just a few miles from the border when they were eventually captured and forced into to surrender. And this is a very famous quote from Chief Joseph. He said, "Hear me, my chiefs, my heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever." So that's Chief Joseph. All right. So moving on to some new American policies towards natives. Now, Helen Hunt Jackson, really important author that I would like you to make sure you recognize and know. She wrote a book called A Century of Dishonor, where she basically called out the United States and the government's policies towards Native Americans, saying how detrimental and harmful they were, and that they never followed through with their treaties, and that it was cruel and all of this. I mean, so she's attempting to kind of be an ally for the natives by kind of standing up for them against government policies. How she had an idea that she thought would be the most helpful and beneficial for Native Americans. And this is going to be a really important concept, so really pay attention as we get to this. Here are just a few quotes from her book, A Century of Dishonor, where it talks about unfulfilled promises, broken treaties, cruelly suffering at the hands of the government, etc. Well, her idea was something called assimilation, which is that because white Americans viewed the natives as so different and savage, and that their culture was just so far removed from mainstream white American culture, that if natives could learn, the American culture and ways and language and religion and all that kind of stuff, then it would lead to them fitting in a little bit more, and that they would be less feared and less reviled by white Americans, because they would be a little bit more like them, something called Americanizing them. And I always put this in quotation marks because they are Native Americans. So Americanizing them is kind of ridiculous. But anyway, so this idea of assimilation, super, super important. Make them more like mainstream white American culture. Teach them the language, the religion, the general customs, how to dress, how to typical manners that's as perceived by what's acceptable by American standards. And so this idea of assimilation led to a government policy or a law called the Dawes Severalty Act. And so what this did was, it was a law passed that basically said Native Americans would be given land. They get to own 160 acres of land as long as that land is kept in their family. I think it was for 25 years or something. It had to be passed down to the next generation. And it should be farmed using, what Americans viewed as traditional, the acceptable kind of westernized standards of farming. Now, there's a problem with this, because I've told you before, Native Americans do not believe in private ownership of land. So saying that land should be divided into plots, and that this family has this land and this family has this land, and that you must farm this land and do with the land what someone else tells you to do, is not something that many of them liked or agreed with. On top of that, many of them, even if they did follow through with the terms of the law, they never actually got the deeds to the land. In fact, there was a huge class action lawsuit back about 20 years ago, that made it to the Supreme Court, where Native Americans basically were claiming that their ancestors never got the deeds, or like their grandparents' issues about where great grandparents never got the deeds of the land that they were promised under the Dawes Severalty Act. They ended up winning the lawsuit, but they each, I think it broke down to getting like $1,000 per family, which was really nothing compared to what they were out. But anyway, so private ownership of land. And the Dawes Severalty Act also started boarding schools for Native American children to go. Places like the Carlisle School, which the assignment that you should be working on is about the Carlisle School. And the idea is to teach them how to behave, how to dress, how to sit, in a chair all nice and with good posture, and how to eat with a fork. And the idea is to take them away from their ordinary surroundings. That's the point of a boarding school. Take you out of your normal kind of environment, put you in a new place where you teach them all these new behaviors and acts, and then they learn that and they assimilate, they take on those characteristics. So please know that the Dawes Severalty Act, the purpose was to assimilate and to make them more Americanized, again with the quotation marks. And so it provided private ownership of land and boarding schools. All right, and another major impact on the Native Americans was the impact on the buffaloes. I think I've talked about this before earlier in the year, but the Plains natives particularly relied on the buffalo. They used every part of the buffalo, whether it was the hide for materials or clothes, or the bones for weapons, or the horns, or even the hooves could be made into a type of paste or glue. But they used every part of the buffalo, and it was deemed as sacred to them. But as more white settlers moved out west, they had one primary purpose for the buffalo, and that was for sport. Now there were fur traders, but so fur was an important part of it too, but really just the idea of shooting them for fun as they rode on the tops of trains, pow, 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 was just fun entertainment for them. And then they would just leave the carcasses to rot in the sun, and the parts would decompose and not even be useful. The meat couldn't even be used, especially since they've killed so many of them. So sport was the biggest impact on the natives as far as like how the settlers used them. And these numbers are pretty incredible, that in about 1800, it was estimated that there were 65 million buffalo in North America. And if you then factor in about 40 years, 50, 60 years or so of manifest destiny, that by the end of the century, they went from 65 million down to about 1,000, until there were laws put into place to protect the buffalo from hunting and all of that. And those eventually did cause the buffalo population to come back up. So there's more than 1,000 buffalo now, but they were close to extinction because of settlers on that land. The ghost dance movement was a movement by natives to kind of oppose white settlement. They would have these ghost dance kind of rituals. It was a religious type movement. Sitting Bull was one of the leaders within it, but the American government viewed this as antagonistic, and they had Sitting Bull actually arrested and killed as part of the ghost dance movement. And the final event of this unit this little section is Wounded Knee. Wounded Knee is in South Dakota. And what happened here was that natives were basically surrounded and forced to surrender. They had to give up their weapons. And then after they had surrendered their weapons, the troops opened fire on them and killed 300 unarmed Native Americans. And it was this particular battle that signified the end of the resistance of the natives, that they would no longer continue to fight. And this is a very symbolic and important event of Native American history, the Battle of Wounded Knee, the end of the resistance, where they were unarmed and massacred there in the snow. And here Black Elk is saying, I did not know then how much was ended. I look back now from a high hill of old age, and I can still see the butchered women and children lying heaped and scattered all along the gulch. It was a dream died there. And that is where I have to stop. I am out of time.